Welcome to the Redbeard Embodiment Podcast. I am your host, Alex Greene, and I'm on a mission to bring the power of embodiment to people all around the world. In this podcast, we explore how embodiment practices, trauma healing, and knowledge about the human nervous system can help us find our ground, discover new sources of meaning, and create connection in an ever-changing world. The deepest change is embodied change. Hi, welcome to episode 10 of the Redbeard Embodiment Podcast. Today I'm going to do an exploration of my own practice and my history working with trauma through the lens of the body. And so I was just going to kind of go back in time and share a little bit about the experiences that led me to train in the modalities that I have and how I weave them together in my treatment approach with my clients today. So my original entry point into trauma work was through structural integration bodywork. And I studied under two teachers, Everett Ogawa, who had had a school he called Integral Bodywork, and then with a woman named Audrey Nakamura and a form called Zen Body Therapy. And my interest in bodywork had arisen out of my sort of years doing Zen and martial arts training connected to a particular group in Honolulu, Hawaii. And I had heard that that there were ways in which working with the body was a way to help not only sort of change things musculoskeletally and things like that, but also as a way to work with psycho-emotional history, trauma, and things like that. And so that was my original entry. This is back around 2010. I got interested in exploring that work, and I'll share that story in fuller detail in another podcast. But once I started doing structural integration bodywork, which by the way comes out of the Rolfing tradition. So Ida Rolf was a very pioneering figure in developing a manual therapy called Rolfing Structural Integration. It was known as a very comprehensive and deep tissue approach to working with the physical structure of the human body. And by physical structure, what it means is how the soft tissue, the muscles and the connective tissue and the fascia are arranged around the skeleton in order to support postural alignment and things like that. So the style of structural integration that I studied was derived from Ida Rolf's work, but also with a few other elements kind of added in. So I began my private practice in Madison, Wisconsin, and I loved doing the work. When it had been very impactful for me personally when I started receiving structural integration bodywork. It was a big deal, not only in terms of freeing up a sense of possibilities within movement and alignment and structure within my body, but also I got a tremendous amount of self-insight in terms of some of my emotional patterning and things that I was carrying on to, and why am I stressed by certain things, and how does that show up as holding patterns within my soft tissue itself. So I had a lot of big, I guess I would call it a somatic opening. That's a word I use sometimes, even with my clients, when something very significant happens where suddenly we are much more intimately connected with sensation in the body, and oftentimes with going through a phase where a lot of meaning is arising out of that as well, meaning we're understanding something about ourselves or our lives from having done that work. So I had gotten hooked on this style of working with people because, again, I mean, my own impact was significant. But as I began to work with people, it just was incredibly profound. I mean, on the one hand, I was happy to, to me, structural integration work, it is physical work. So it very much helps people liberate a sense of that they can stand, and that they can stand in a tall way, stand in a grounded way, create more of a feeling of balance within themselves, be able to move with more freedom, feel lighter in the sense of their organization. So all of these things were commonplace and very good. I mean, wonderful to help people in that way. But equally important, as I delved in over these early several years of practice, was seeing how people bring their psycho-emotional history, of course, with them to the bodywork table. And so inevitably, I was either explicitly or implicitly sensing or hearing about the things that had shaped people's lives. And one way that shows up commonly, I think most body workers can identify with this experience, massage therapists and body workers, that as in the course of our work, whether we're working in the neck or doing release work in the legs or the psoas muscle through the abdominal core, there's always the possibility of the client accessing emotion and sometimes memory on the bodywork table. So that became a sort of a commonplace experience. And in my training for structural integration, that was very much understood as an important part of the process, that we were to be sensitive to hold space for. But we didn't have a lot of specificity in our training around anything beyond just sort of holding space in a general sense of the word. And that in some ways was natural for me. I think part of my draw to the work was to hold space in a powerful way for people getting in touch with themselves. Certainly coming out of those years of meditation experience and my own body work, I had significant. I had been down that road myself, and so providing that context and opportunity for others was really natural. But I became curious about, did we know more about the nervous system and trauma than had been known at the time, that in the years of Ida Rolf, when she was developing Rolfing in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and the people who had extended the work from then. And as I looked around within the field of trauma, I discovered that what I sometimes refer to as the neurobiological revolution of the 21st century. And what I mean by that is that from about the year 2000 on, I mean, in some ways, that's an arbitrary line because the roots of this movement go earlier. But from about the year 2000 on, with the advent of the Polyvagal Theory coming from Dr. Stephen Porges, and the work of Peter Levine in somatic experiencing, and the work of Dr. David Berceli with TRE tension and trauma releasing exercises, and others, that there had been sort of a new wave of investigating from a neurobiological perspective what is occurring at the level of the body. So it became important for me to, that was sort of the next phase of my study, was to get involved in that work. So circling back a little bit in terms of how, at that stage in my training, or not in that stage of my practice, what was I seeing that I was interpreting as trauma in the body? On the one hand, as I mentioned, doing hands-on physical work, on the one hand, certainly the tension patterns. So if we're working with an area of habitual tension, sometimes tension releases quite readily, and sometimes it doesn't. And if it doesn't release quite readily, there's lots of reasons. I mean, that could be just the way that you're habitually using the body, or a longstanding injury that's creating a compensation pattern. So there's a lot of possibilities, but another possibility for something that is not easy to change, meaning even though you're applying the massage techniques and things like that, another possibility is that it's part of a traumatic bracing pattern. And so what I've come to understand is pretty much in alignment with people like Wilhelm Reich, who coined the word body armor, but I'm pretty much a believer in this model that uh, we carry within our physical structure um, patterns of stress that are organized around, usually around preventing the expression of some kind of an emotion. So if we are not comfortable expressing anger or grief or joy or something like that, there are ways unconsciously that we restrict we inhibit the muscles associated with that, and that becomes a chronic pattern within the body. And so then when we work with those patterns physically, like with structural integration bodywork or other techniques, and we can temporarily get that pattern, in a way we challenge that pattern, or we ask it to let go for a period of time. If there's sort of a traumatic aspect to it, very often some emotional response it goes along with that, because that pattern was connected with the inhibition of that emotional expression. The other thing that I was starting to observe in my bodywork sessions was that uh, as I'm doing my tissue release, sometimes I would observe a movement, or sometimes a tremoring or trembling in the client, and sometimes that would be the knees that were quivering. Sometimes it would be in the face or the eyes or the jaw, but like a subtle or even not so subtle kind of a vibration type of an experience. And in my own history, when I had first gone through the series of 10 sessions as part of structural integration, in one of my sessions, I don't remember which one, I think it was in session 3, and the body worker was working to release the connective tissue around my rib cage, and I was laying on my back and my knees were bent, and so my knees were standing tall, my feet were flat on the table. And I had just a significant, all of a sudden my knees started quivering, and then even more and more. And then my hips were shaking, and my whole pelvis and lower spine. And I probably could have stopped it if I wanted to, but it was very much something that was occurring on its own while the body worker was working to release this somewhat sensitive tissue all up around my rib cage and moving up towards my armpit and the axilla area. And I asked her, I said, "Is this okay? Should I let it happen?" And she said, "Yeah, it's a release. Just go ahead and let that happen." And it probably lasted about 20 or 30 minutes before it wound down, and she moved into a different section of working on me. And it was so interesting to me. I'd never had anything like that happen. It felt, in a way, it felt very good. It felt very natural and useful. Um, and something very much had changed when I got up off the bodywork table. I had sort of a very different sensation in how the weight distributed in my body, and the sensation in my legs, and a feeling of flexibility and freedom in my pelvis. And so clearly, whatever that had been important. Um, but the most my body worker could say was, "It's okay. That's some kind of release. You're good." And I guess that was enough to not be worried about it. But I have enough of kind of an inquiring scientific mind that I always sort of wondered, well, I wanted to know more about what that experience had been like. That was about 10 years before I studied and became a body worker myself. So anyway, coming into these first several years of practice where I was doing structural integration work day in, day out, and I would also sometimes see, sometimes as significant as what had happened to me, sometimes more at a medium or even a subtle level. And so I kept seeing evidence that the nervous system was showing up, often in the form of this kind of vibration pattern. when earlier I mentioned sort of realizing that there was all this new information coming from somatic experiencing and TRE, and so that was the whole world that opened up to me. This is around 2014, 2015 or so. And the order was first it was TRE, and I sort of an interesting story there, where a colleague of mine who I was trading some work with, she kept telling me about TRE, and it's really good for releasing the psoas muscle, and the psoas is sort of a deep muscle that we work on a lot in structural integration work, and she kept mentioning this thing, and it was really useful. And I don't know, I was kind of tuning her out. I mean, you can only learn so many things, that kind of an attitude. But she asked me to be her demo, or sort of a guinea pig. She was going through a certification training, and she basically just needed somebody to practice on. So I said, sure, of course. So she came over to my apartment. We Skyped with somebody online. That was her supervisor, was gonna observe her that way. And she led me through the TRE process, and any of you who've been following in the podcast know that TRE has become a very significant part of my practice. And what the way it works is you lay on the floor, your knees are you set up in it after some sort of basic warm up exercises that get the breath and the body moving. Then you lay on the floor in a particular position that's sort of kind of opening up your hips. You're in a butterfly position. And then you go through a series of movements where you bring your knees towards one another. And as you do that, it initiates a trembling or quivering response in your inner thigh muscles. And then by the time your knees are vertical and your feet become flat, now you have that tremoring that got started. It continues for as long as you allow it, and you relax into it. And then very often that tremoring experience spreads into different parts of your body, depending as you relax into it. So she led me through this process, and I got very significant tremors, and it was very, very, very similar to the thing that had happened to me 10 years prior, when I had gone through the structural integration series. So I was so excited. As soon as the session ended, I immediately went on Amazon. I ordered the 2 books from Dr. David Berceli that were available about this thing, which I learned was called neurogenic tremoring. And the reason I was excited is because I realized there's somebody who knows what this is, knows how to stimulate it in a consistent way, and also has created a therapeutic modality centered around this thing. So it was like exactly what I had been waiting for without realizing it in a way. So I was lucky. He was coming to Madison, Wisconsin a few months later to lead a certification workshop. I joined the program in person. I was just as convinced as I had been in that initial session. And so that began a period over a couple years where I was doing a lot with the neurogenic tremor mechanism, first in myself, because almost everything I like to experiment on myself first. But I was incorporating the neurogenic tremor mechanism with many of my clients as an adjunct to this structural integration bodywork. And I was sharing feedback around that with Dr. Berceli, because as a body worker himself, he was very interested in how those things, or in what I was seeing in my practice, basically. So TRE was actually my gateway into learning about the autonomic nervous system, becoming aware of the Polyvagal Theory, which suggests that we have several branches of our parasympathetic nervous system that are related to stress and traumatic response. And this also opened me to the work of Bessel van der Kolk, and around the same time, his extremely best-selling book, The Body Keeps the Score, came out, which was also really validating from a neuroscientific perspective that modalities like somatic experiencing, EMDR, yoga therapy, and others, things that were approaching trauma through the body, were in many ways the key to resolving unresolved stress and trauma responses in PTSD. And the next big chapter in that journey was doing the somatic experiencing training. That's Peter Levine's work. What I loved so much about somatic experiencing, and I'll talk more about it as in this conversation here, but what I loved initially so much about it, it was a very comprehensive program that both looked, in the first year, is all about learning about the autonomic nervous system in response to stress and trauma in a very useful, comprehensive way, and learning about how the stress and trauma response shows up in animals, discharge through tremoring is a common feature of somatic experiencing, not quite in the same way as in TRE, but similar. So it was sort of and it was a framework that in TRE we just directly stimulate this neurogenic tremor response, but in somatic experiencing there's a whole laying of a foundation first around helping a person become aware of their own stress and trauma responses in the body, become educated about the workings of their autonomic nervous system, develop a lot of safety and self-regulation both in the therapeutic relationship, but also showing the person some tools for self-regulating using breath, using eye movements, using grounding techniques, using resourcing techniques. So that toolkit was very useful for working with clients where there was more activation and more charge, where TRE might be a little bit too might not be the best tool at the beginning because not having done sufficient kind of creating a safe container first. That can be done with TRE, I also know, but there are situations where in SC I really appreciate that. And then in the second year of the somatic experiencing trainer, they do a beautiful job of going through many, many, many different categories of traumatic experiences. One thing I really appreciate about the curriculum is there is just sort of a progression of looking at everything from different kinds of accidents like falls and injuries that were, no malicious intent, but then looking at things like violence, looking at sexual trauma as its own category of trauma, looking at medical trauma and surgical history and hospital stays as its own category of trauma, looking at early developmental experiences and birth trauma as sort of as its own category, looking at social and racialized trauma, marginalization. So it was that middle year of the SE curriculum really opened my eyes about looking at all the many different ways of experiences that shape how we, our embodiment of trauma, so to speak. I kind of differentiate my work between the hands-on work that I do and the non-hands-on work that I do through somatic coaching. So in the bodywork side of things, the modalities that I trained in originally was structural integration, which I mentioned, and there are two other ones that are important, have become important to my work. One is myofascial release in the John Barnes style of myofascial release, and then the other one is zero balancing. And just briefly, why I valued those and started to incorporate them into my body work. For the myofascial release, what I really like is it's a very different way of working than in structural integration. The work is a little bit more direct. There's more pressure definitely within the range of tolerance, but it's sort of a direct application of pressure either into the trigger points within the muscles or mechanically sort of opening the connective tissue around big muscle groups or at the ligaments and tendons and things like that. In myofascial release, it is a slower way of working, but slower doesn't mean less deep. Because what MFR is really doing is creating stretches. So you use your hands, it's called a cross hand release, where you're engaging the connective tissue in one side of a muscle group, for example, and then you're engaging the tissue in another. And then you're creating a sustained hold, usually for 3 minutes or longer, engaging one particular position. That could be anywhere on the body, within the abdomen, on the legs, in the arms, across the rib cage, around the throat, in the face, in the skull. So, and so you are setting up, so in an hour session, you might only be doing 5 or 6 placements of where your hands are, but you're holding them for a very long time, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, sometimes longer. And what's interesting with this slow approach is that if you have to sort of develop a certain kind of a patience, but if you do, very often that there'll be sort of stages of release where you might be hanging out with nothing much happening for about 2-3 minutes, and suddenly you feel a lengthening of the tissue, or the breath changes, or they start to get attuned to some new sensation or even some kind of emotional experience or something like that. And so that approach I really valued as that sometimes a good way to work with the tissue is that direct approach that we do through structural integration, but having the tool of an indirect approach or a slower approach really was useful. I think of it a little bit in terms of yin and yang, coming from Taoism. Yang being a little bit more direct, masculine, kind of an approach. That's the structural integration, and yin being a slower, quieter, but certainly as powerful through the myofascial release. So that became a really important piece for me to pull in. And then thirdly is a modality called zero balancing. And zero balancing was developed by a guy who was an osteopath, basically studying bones, but then he was also in the first graduating class of Westerners who had studied acupuncture. This was maybe in the 60s, something like that, in London. And so zero balancing is a way of working, using touch to influence the bony system, not the muscular connective tissue system, but the bones. But because of his Chinese medicine background, he developed a very beautiful understanding of looking at the flows of qi or energy within the structure at the level of the bone. So in his view, acupuncture deals with the currents of qi or energy flow in the soft tissues of the body, but that there are ways of addressing the qi flow in the bony structure of the body. And that became very interesting for me. One of the things that really grabbed me about that work was that he had put together a very useful vocabulary of describing what he learned to perceive as energy within the body. And instead of just being sort of a little bit generic, like, okay, we're feeling flow or expansion or things like that, he was very specific in his language in terms of feeling something contracting or lengthening or something dispersing or gathering. And his vocabulary of energetic flow that you could learn to perceive through touch was very useful for me as a body worker, because I was already sensing in many ways those things and struggling to, in a way, come up with my own way of understanding and a vocabulary around it. And so his work provided a really, in some ways, it really validated what I was already observing, and then provided a framework for understanding it. So so these days when I'm doing body work, I don't call it structural integration bodywork. I don't call it myofascial release. I don't call it zero balancing. Even though I include those things, I do it under the banner of Zen integration bodywork, which is a term that I coined over the last 3 years as I have worked to synthesize the various approaches I have studied in my training, and then my work as a Zen practitioner, and then my education through trauma and the nervous system. In a way, it's Zen integration bodywork is a synthesis of that kind of the broad training that I've had over the last decade plus into a form that kind of matches the way that I support people today. So that's kind of on the bodywork side of the work that I'm doing. When it comes to the other half of my work, the non-hands-on work, that's where I am under the banner of Somatic Coaching. I'm working with somatic experiencing, often TRE, tension trauma releasing exercises, and very often with internal family systems work, and then with DARE. DARE is relates to attachment work. And so I think it might be good to talk a little bit about how those things work together. Yeah, so typically when I'm working in somatic coaching, what I'm mostly doing, and some of that work is online, and then some of it is now in person here in Boulder, Colorado, since I've been returned to working in person again in the last 9 months. And when I'm doing somatic coaching, I'm really pulling in very often several elements. So the starting point for almost all of the work that I do is with somatic experiencing. And I view somatic experiencing as it's sort of like a hub and spoke model where somatic experiencing is kind of the center. And then very often I'm extending our work to include things like TRE, IFS, DARE work, sometimes brain spotting, and others. But in a way, they center around a core of somatic experiencing. And the reason I do it that way is in SE, the first few sessions that we do, I consider it laying a foundation. And what we're laying a foundation around is the working environment. And the first thing I share with new clients is that whenever we work together, we sort of are entering into a space where we really care about the sensations that are arising in the body. And we're going to kind of throw out the everyday rules around being sort of kind of polite social engagement. And so it's things like, many of us have ideas like, okay, well, we should sit up straight, or we need to make eye contact, or if we yawn, the person's going to think that we're bored or tired. And so these are, most of us are familiar with these kinds of things. And when I'm newly working with clients, I say, hey, listen, let's just throw all of that out the window. In this space, what I want is that you can sit any way you want to, breathe any way you want to. If you're sighing at some point, that's fine. If your body wants to fidget or move or adjust, that's completely appropriate. Because in a way, we want to prioritize the signals and sensations arising from the body and the nervous system. And in somatic experiencing, over the first several sessions, we're not trying to work with trauma. Typically, at the very beginning, we are trying to work sort of in a more here and now sense. And so the early skills that we learn are just sort of some of the fundamentals of SE, things like tracking sensation, becoming very interested and curious about how to describe what a person is aware of, everything from where they're feeling their points of connection on the floor, the chair, things like that. Noticing what areas feel comfortable, what areas feel neutral, what areas typically feel uncomfortable. What areas is there a lot of sensation, meaning it's easy to sense it? What areas are kind of dark spots? There's not much sensation to feel. And then we work with some very simple nervous system regulation things around looking around the room that's called orienting. We work with different styles of breathing, moving the body in different ways. And we start to learn that almost if we do anything, whether it's we look around the room, whether we close the eyes, whether we make a certain kind of a breath, and even if we only do a few of whatever that stimulation is, if we're really paying attention, we start to learn that the body responds. So if we take a big breath and a sigh, and then we pause and we watch to see, we will learn to notice that in fact that's had some kind of an effect, and we can describe that effect. So our early work, these first few sessions, is around doing that. That lets me get to know sort of a person's connection to their body. And I can also learn, like, what are the kinds of things that help them feel more relaxed, safe, regulated, grounded, because that's good. It's good for me to know as the nervous system worker, to know what helps that person feel more safe and stable. And then also, what are the kinds of things that bring up their activation patterns? An activation pattern is just another word for a stressor. So, bringing up sensation of anxiety in the body, for instance, or touching upon where we work on something and it starts to bring up traumatic memory or something. So I can start to learn the lay of the land in these early explorations. From there, we make it's a little bit, we co-create the path. So sometimes we would, after these initial sessions, we would use somatic experiencing to do some particular work. Maybe the person is running up against a stress response at work or something. So not quite the level of trauma, but it's something that's bothering them. They're trying to feel more at ease, get some clarity around how to proceed, not feel so charged around the situation. So that's just an example of the kind of thing we would maybe work with. Or we might decide that there's something from the past, maybe some particular periods in the person's life or events or traumas that we want to visit using the tools of SE. And one of the main attributes of somatic experiencing is it's a way of working with something stressful and traumatic in a really slowed down way that's very much oriented to safety. Whenever we begin, if we're going to do a session where we're going to work with trauma, we always start with really anchoring into sort of safety first, feeling good here in the room, good in the body, good in the breath, really centered. And then in the word we use in somatic experiencing is titration, where we would only where we begin to look at the traumatic activation in a certain kind of a rhythm, where we do a piece of work and then we return to more of the here and now, where things are regulated and fine and safe and everything's good. And we would do a rhythm where we're working with the activation. And very often, if we're approaching a stressor or a trauma without a rush, having first built up a lot of safety, co-regulation between me and the client, then doing the work itself of revisiting the trauma and releasing some of the charge and the emotion and the activation behind it, it often isn't so hard once we actually get to it. So that's if we sort of stay with somatic experiencing. Now, pretty often, there's reasons why we might start to bring in some of the other pieces that I mentioned before, the TRE, IFS, DARE. brain spotting. So just to kind of give an idea of why those things come up, I'll start with TRE because in some ways it's common that I would bring that one into our conversation pretty early in the relationship. And what I suggest with TRE is that we first, the way I frame it is that we'll do a session together where I lead them through this process. Excuse me. By this stage, we already have a pretty good therapeutic alignment, and uh, my goal of our initial tremoring session is to show them that from a place of relaxation, they can find their way towards this tremoring experience that I described earlier had happened with me in bodywork, but in a way that is not stressful, not scary, something that feels very organic and authentic, and allowing the nervous system in a very, very direct way to release the kinds of tensions associated with stress and trauma. My goal with TRE, this is true for SC and everything, is we're not trying to do everything all at once. That's pretty much never my style. What I have learned is that whatever tool we're using, if we're not in a rush, but we approach each session as a safe, well-contained, and manageable session, our progress is going to be much quicker in the scheme of things than if we try to do too much or go too hard or things like that. So what I really love about TRE is it shows them that there's kind of a direct access to the nervous system. For many people, that's very powerful, very moving to experience that. And then it now becomes a part of our treatment plan. And for some people, there's a rhythm where, say every fourth session, we do a shaking session together. Or other people, they start to do it independently on their own. And we begin our session with a little bit of a check-in so I can listen and see how the tremoring process is going. Is it supporting their work? So oftentimes TRE gets layered in that way, that it's something that the client's doing independently and also, but sometimes together in our session. So that is with TRE. Now, IFS, internal family systems work, the reason that I would introduce that into our model, and just as a brief description of how IFS works, IFS is referring to the parts of our inner world, or what's sometimes called some sub-personalities. And it's this idea that our psyche isn't just sort of one thing, but is comprised of different roles within our system. And there's what's called the protective system. And protectors are things like our inner critic, or what we call a manager, who makes sure we get up on time and are prepared for the meetings that we have. So that's sort of our managers. They're kind of thinking about the future and making sure we're doing well. And then there's other parts of our protectors, our soothers or distractors, are sometimes called firefighters in the IFS model. And that what their job is to provide some relief to the system, oftentimes with, looking at your phone, watching TV, any sort of addiction you could imagine would be at the extreme end. But anyway, so all of us have these parts, some more extreme than others. And then there's something called the exiles, and exiles, or another word for them, is our inner child parts, or our tender parts, or ones with vulnerability. Oftentimes, those are ones that are not at the foreground of our experience. But if we look at the kinds of hurts and emotional hurts that we've had, very often we can recognize that almost behind the scenes is a part that carries a wound and some vulnerability around something. And the protective system, the managers and the firefighters and distractors and soothers, are working on behalf of, in some ways, protecting those more tender parts of the system. So the reason that when I bring IFS into the work I do with clients, well, first of all, some people come in with that intention. IFS becomes so popular in the last several years because it's a very, very useful framework. So some people, we do start there because that is their interest. But even if we haven't begun there, where I start to bring in IFS is as we're discussing history, whether that's, or even, going back to my example where somebody was stressed in a work environment, maybe how to interact with their boss and some complicated dynamics there, it may be useful to begin to look at some of the parts involved. For example, there may be a part that's really afraid of a conflict. Okay. And then the person might recognize, yep, I've got that part. That's my conflict avoider. And then there may be one that's really angry, which is very different. A conflict avoiding part and a really angry part are definitely not the same, right? But it's not at all uncommon that we might have both of those roles in our system when we're around something where we have mixed feelings or mixed reactions towards something. So IFS is a framework where we can really start to separate, get clearer and more specific about some of the complex emotions we have towards things current in our life, or even as we look backwards towards a childhood or a traumatic history that we're working to resolve. And then the last one, well, actually, I'll mention DARE and then brain spotting briefly. So DARE comes out of Diane Poole Heller's work, and it's centered around attachment trauma and developmental history. And I view DARE really as a sort of an extension of somatic experiencing in the way that I use it in my practice. And that makes sense because Diane Poole Heller is a former faculty for somatic experiencing. So she was a teacher for many years. She's worked very closely with Peter Levine. And so her work in many ways is similar or modeled around the flow of a somatic experiencing session. And in a somatic experiencing session, we always begin with safety, and then we work through the body to see if there's any stress, activation, or trauma that we want to work with. So those are things that are not so safe. But we begin and we end with safety because safety is our tool for making successful progress in somatic experiencing. And in attachment work, it's a very similar idea, except our area of focus is around relationships. Or what sort of our attachment system or relational system. And so the analog of safety from an attachment perspective is the term we use is secure attachment. And secure attachment from attachment theory is this idea that the idealized experience of if we imagine going way back in time to our infancy or early childhood, and if we had the perfect caregivers, the idealized, perfectly attuned parental figures or other caregivers, where they were responsive to our needs, available with their presence, loving with their demeanor. If all those ingredients were there, that's sort of what creates this idea of an ideal attachment. And we could look at adult relationships, whether that's romantic relationships or relationships at work or with friends, and we could look at it through the lens of to what degree are we living into, is there security within the relationship, and to what degree are we having some adaptive responses, probably learned from childhood, around either being anxious about the relationship, which would sort of show up as not feeling safety that the relationship is going to support whatever's going on, or there could be some avoidance of the connection or the intimacy. These are sort of relational dynamics. And so when I bring attachment work into our somatic experiencing framework, we start to talk about real life relationship, maybe with their spouse, maybe with their kids, maybe with other people. And we explore what is the body pattern connected when things are not right. So if there's some avoidance, if there's some anxiousness, how is that showing up how can that be felt in a direct way? And we have various tools of using secure attachment as our reference point. Sometimes we use our relationship. Because I try to create security in our therapeutic relationship. Sometimes we use that as an example. Sometimes the person has an example of somebody in their life that has really been available in a consistent, safe way in relationship. That becomes a reference from which we can explore other pieces. And the last modality that I have training in that I think I'll mention is brain spotting. And brain spotting is such an interesting work. It is an approach that developed out as a sort of a evolution from EMDR, and EMDR has become very well known and researched as a trauma therapy. And brain spotting is similar in the fact that it works with eye positioning and eye position as a gateway to neurophysiological states associated with stress, trauma, or safety. So in a brain spotting session, we use something. I'll even use it right here. We use something to provide a visual reference for somebody looking within the visual field. And we identify places within the visual field where there's more safety and anchor and calming in the physiology. And we look for places where there's more activation. And the way that I integrate brain spotting with my somatic experiencing approach is I usually pay just as much attention to safety or resourcing brain spots as I do to activation brain spots, because in a way, brain spotting is just another stimulus of accessing the embodied state that we're trying to resolve. So it's just another tool to create the kind of processing that we do in somatic experiencing. So that's a survey of how SE is normally my beginning point with clients, but how TRE, IFS, attachment work, and brain spotting, they all may play a role in the overall treatment approach. Typically just connecting through the website. I've got two websites. The Redbeard Somatic Therapy is the group practice that I own and manage. And so I'm listed there. And then through my direct website, alexgreene.com, both places sort of show my the work that I do and provide a scheduling link. And I do consultations with people very often as a starting point, just to understand what they're coming in with and develop the best sort of rhythm for working together. And sometimes I am working in where we begin in a somewhat open-ended way, or like where we'll start with somatic experiencing and we'll say, for example, we'll do 3 sessions or we'll do 10 sessions or something. And from there, we will plan what we do next, or do we need more of that? With some clients, we think a little bit further ahead. We might plan on a 3 or a 6 month engagement. I create what I call just custom somatic coaching programs, where we just basically create a plan where we decide in advance some of the elements that we want to bring together. And very often that's somatic experiencing, TRE, internal family systems. And sometimes we even move in phases where we emphasize one of those practices. And if the person is local to Colorado, Boulder, Colorado, where I am, we might also include a phase of, we might even build in hands-on work, body work, as a part of our overall treatment strategy. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Redbeard Embodiment Podcast. To learn more, visit us at redbeardsomatictherapy.com or send me an email at alex@redbeardsomatictherapy.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, help spread the word by subscribing and sharing with others. Hope to see you next time.